Good evening and welcome to African Perspective with me, Aldrin Simpier. It is a new year and as always, we have a date every Wednesday evening at 9 o'clock right here on the SABC's news channel. Remember, you can interact with us on Twitter using the handle @AfricanPerspec1. It's the first program of the year and already international relations are dominating the news agenda. U.S. President Donald Trump says an early warning system helped prevent any fatalities from the Iranian ballistic missile attack on U.S. bases in Iraq. Trump has been speaking at the White House. He says the top Iranian general killed in a U.S. drone strike in Iraq, Qasem Soleimani, was a legitimate target. Trump has also warned Iran against any further attacks on U.S. interests in the region. Tehran have earlier warned that they would strike the U.S. at a time and place of its choosing after the U.S. strike killed Soleimani. Trump has urged Europe and China to join the U.S. in withdrawing from the Iran nuclear deal.
We've said very clearly that if the United States takes any further action, Iran will respond accordingly and we will respond in a very harsh way, but proportionately. Well, we did not start this process of escalation. The United States waged an economic war against Iran. The United States has to come to its senses. The presence of Iranian people in the streets of many cities, unprecedented in the history, a sea of humanity, has to bring the United States to its senses that they should stop listening to clowns, that they should base their policy based on realities.
We are independent, and we do not need Middle East oil. The American military has been completely rebuilt under my administration at a cost of $2.5 trillion. U.S. armed forces are stronger than ever before. Our missiles are big, powerful, accurate, lethal, and fast. Under construction are many hypersonic missiles. The fact that we have this great military and equipment, however, does not mean we have to use it. We do not want to use it. American strength, both military and economic, is the best deterrent. 3 months ago, after destroying 100% of ISIS and its territorial caliphate, we killed the savage leader of ISIS, al-Baghdadi, who was responsible for so much death, including the mass beheadings of Christians, Muslims, and all who stood in his way. He was a monster. Al-Baghdadi was trying again to rebuild the ISIS caliphate and failed. Tens of thousands of ISIS fighters have been killed or captured during my administration. ISIS is a natural enemy of Iran. The destruction of ISIS is good for Iran, and we should work together on this and other shared priorities. Finally, to the people and leaders of Iran, we want you to have a future, and a great future, one that you deserve, one of prosperity at home and harmony with the nations of the world. The United States is ready to embrace peace with all who seek it. I want to thank you, and God bless America.
Meanwhile, the U.S. has deployed more soldiers to Kenya's Manda Bay Island to bolster security following Sunday's terror attack at Kenya's Defense Forces military base used by the U.S. for training regional forces on anti-terrorism. 3 Americans were killed in the attack, according to the U.S. Africa Command. And on Wednesday, Iran government officials in Kenya distanced their government from the airfield attack. It's also emerging that at least 1 Kenyan civilian was killed in the terror attack.
Security personnel and officials in Kenya have been on high alert since the December festivities season began, and that has continued well into the new year, especially as the country approaches January the 15th, the anniversary of the Dusit D2 attack in Nairobi, in which at least 21 people were killed. Now, that has also been heightened by the fact that there has been several attacks towards the beginning of the year here in the country. One at a military installation in the Lamu Island, and another in a bus still in that area. There was also an attack in which 4 people died in the area of Garissa on the border with Somalia. The US-Iran tensions have also raised tensions here in the country, with a lot of people fearing that the country may be a target because it has a lot of US interests. This afternoon, the Iran embassy officials here in the country issued a press statement reassuring Kenyans that they are safe, and indeed civilians everywhere will be spared from any retaliatory attacks that they may decide to carry out.
There is no any relation between Iran and US tension and Kenya. We have received a lot of sympathy for this really horrific attack towards Mr. General Qasem Soleimani from Kenyans. And Kenyans all the time during the history was our close and deep friends. And by the way, I want to clarify for you, even we have a right of retaliation and revenge toward this act of war, but in that time we divided between civilians and the US troops and militaries. It means we send a message to all the Americans. We are not trying to kill civilians, because there is a big difference between Iranian government and US government. That's the big difference.
And that's the story that has been dominating the news around the world. The current tensions in the Middle East will have an impact around the world, and the African continent is not immune to the effects of such hostilities by other countries. This week, South African Finance Minister Ditto Mboweni warned that the escalation of tensions between Iran and the US will have an impact on the South African economy and other countries. We've already seen the price of Brent crude oil reaching almost $70 per barrel. To look at the impact of these tensions in the Gulf region, we are joined by the ANC's National Executive Committee member, as well as the Subcommittee Chairperson on International Relations, Lindiwe Zulu, who's joining us from our Kimberley studio. And right here in studio, we're joined by Faith Mabera, who is a researcher at the Institute for Global Dialogue. Good evening and welcome to the show. Minister, let's start off with you. The ANC celebrating its 108th anniversary today, and later on this weekend we expect an address from the president of the ANC, who will be delivering the ANC's NEC statement. The question then is, will the president be touching on at least this very significant global issue?
Yes, absolutely. You will be aware of the fact that every time the African National Congress, through its president, issues a statement in January 8th, it covers all aspects of the lives, firstly, of the members of the African National Congress, its branches, and the work that it does. But it also gets into the issues that are of major concern for the country in relation to what the African National Congress is expected to do through its government. Then, of course, it always goes to international relations. It's always a norm, it's always a practice that the statement will contain issues that are related to international relations, and usually the president will refer to decisions of the conference, in this case the 54th conference, the resolutions of that conference, but also what the expectations will be in the coming year and what focus the ANC should have in relation to international relations and foreign policy.
Yeah. I asked this question on the basis that the ANC had issued a statement on what's currently unfolding in Iran, and the ANC calling what the US did as an international act of terrorism.
Yes, absolutely. What the president would do in this case would not necessarily talk generally only. The president will also refer to what government is going to be doing, taking into consideration also the fact that South Africa will be chairing the AU, and therefore any international interests and issues that are of major concern to the globe, to the relations of different countries, to regional conflicts, to problems around the world, the president definitely will have to make reference to the current challenges, which is not just an issue of the US and Iran, but it also goes deeper into regional challenges and the impact that we are talking about, as Minister Tito Mboweni has said about the impact of this conflict in terms of our own economies, but the peace, security and stability of the region as well as the world.
Faith, let me hear from you. Do you think that we are currently hearing the right noises coming out of the continent? It would almost seem, from at least from my side, and maybe my observation could be wrong, that it's almost like the continent itself is mute on this US-Iran global tension.
I think to an extent we have to appreciate that this almost came out of left field in one sense, but in the other sense it was also a long way coming, especially because we remember as of last year in September, Iran attacked the Saudi oil bases. So it was almost as if it was goading and ratcheting up the tensions, and this is where we've come. We're on the precipice of what many have called another Gulf War in the Middle East. So it's a matter of, I think a lot of the world is approaching it from a wait-and-see perspective, but to also, to a large extent, throughout we've been hearing international voices largely calling for a de-escalation of the tensions. So we're yet to see what will happen, but I think today's morning's events with Iran sending out missiles to the US base in Iraq, I think that's also a key point, because it can also open a window for potential de-escalation if we look at it from another perspective.
But the continent itself, is the continent mute on this matter? Are politicians on the continent mute when it comes to what's currently happening between the US and the Iran tensions? Because, as we've indicated during the introduction as well, and the minister indicated as well, that you have the Minister of Finance that is saying that this tension will have an impact on our economy, if not the economy of the entire continent as well.
Yeah, so that's generally been the approach, almost a kind of apprehension around what the impact would be on global oil prices, generally, number one. You've already seen gold and other assets rallying up. In response, we've seen a surge in the oil prices. But I think for Africans, what is significant for us is because the broad disengagement of the US militarily particularly, which is what one can say this is leading up to, also affects, because the US has indicated that it's also going to draw down its forces, particularly in the base in Niger, which hosts a significant number of US troops in its counter-terrorism and counter-extremism aspects. So that's a direct impact on Africa, because that opens up a vacuum in terms of security, allowing Islamic militants, particularly in the Maghreb and the Sahel, to continue building up their activities in the region.
Minister, listening into the US President Donald Trump earlier on during the press briefing that he delivered from Washington, some people are arguing that it wasn't as fiery as some may have thought it would be, considering, as Faith has indicated now, that there was these missile attacks last night, and the Iranian supreme leader saying that this is just a slap in the face of the US. Looking at the response of Donald Trump, do you think that the way in which he responded was a response that said, there's probably somebody that has whispered in the ear of the US president and said that, let's de-escalate?
Well, it would be very important to appreciate then if there are people who are around the president who then whisper, as you are saying, that maybe they would whisper to him and say, we need to calm down on this issue. Remember that from an African National Congress perspective, we always call for peaceful resolution of conflict. We always call for countries sitting around the table and having a discussion. But first and foremost, we do not want a war. We don't think that the world overall wants a war. Even if you're talking about counterterrorism, even if you're talking about de-escalating any conflict that's happening in any place, it's important, particularly for leaders like President Donald Trump of the United States of America, and considering the American approach in as far as the issues of counterterrorism is concerned. And also if you think about the fact that America cannot think of itself in isolation of all the challenges that are faced by the world. And therefore, if we see, if there's a sign, even if a small sign, that indicates that we might be in a situation of de-escalating of this war, and of course we are aware of the fact that Iran itself has said it is going to step up, it's going to retaliate in response to this. We believe as the African National Congress that collectively we need to find ways and means of reducing warmongering. But we also think that the role of the United Nations or any other international organizations that can lend a hand in the discussions in as far as this is concerned would be useful. From an African National Congress point of view also, we believe that our own president, we believe that our own government can be able to engage from an African perspective, because I hear you talking about the fact that maybe the African countries have not responded enthusiastically about this. I know others will have to have a wait and see, but as a country and also as the African National Congress leading in terms of creating peace, security and stability for the entire world, we would like to see warmongering stopping, but would also like to engage through diplomatic means and also using the United Nations to have serious discussions about this. And we can't afford the war. The world cannot afford any form of war at this point in time.
Earlier on, actually, my colleague Tshepiso Mokwetla spoke to the Minister of Home Affairs, and that press briefing by Donald Trump happened during that interview that Tshepiso was having with the minister. And I just quickly, Faith, want you to listen to what the minister said and then compare it to what the International Subcommittee of the ANC is saying, and then come up with, do we hear again the right noises, at least now coming from South Africa? Let's just take a listen to what the minister had to say.
Trump said nothing at all. In fact, he didn't speak like a head of state. He spoke like a militiaman. That's all I can say. I had nothing to explain what's happening, but I had a macho talk of a militiaman who is praising having lots of weapons and all that, instead of calling for peace around the world, which everybody is striving for. That's quite unfortunate. Very, very unfortunate. In fact, he's bullying all the nation, calling nations which are sitting with him in Security Council at the same level, calling them to reconsider. Yeah, I say we are in trouble. Let me just put it that way. The whole world is in trouble because we have got a man who is a head of a very powerful nation who has got no qualities of leadership at all. It's very, very unfortunate.
A militiaman, we are in trouble.
Well, I think we need to begin to appreciate where this is coming from. It's not completely a shock in that sense. I mean, if you look at, it goes as far back as President Jimmy Carter with his Carter Doctrine, the idea that the stability, U.S. interests, particularly in the Persian Gulf region, were anchored on, number one, ensuring that there's this free passage of oil, ensuring that for instance, something like the Strait of Hormuz goes unblocked, and also containing any gestures of irredentism on the part, particularly in this case, we've seen Iran. So that was a long-standing interest of vital U.S. interest in the region. So the question that we are standing here now is, what is to be gained, particularly?
Yes.
Are we potentially seeing another Gulf war emerging. And the question is, do we regard the US as a force for stability in the Middle East, or is it by and by a spoiler to a large degree? That's the question that confronts us at this moment. And I think it's not an easy answer because, number one, we saw Trump disengaging in terms from the nuclear deal, and the effects is what we saw Iran also reacting to that particular, and it defying the terms of the nuclear deal and aiming closer to acquisition of nuclear weapons. But I think the question now for the rest of the world is, what do we do in this situation? Because are the diplomatic channels, as the minister indicated, still open? Is the question before us, especially because we've seen in this the back and forth that has been going on Twitter, particularly between Iran and the US, is concerning to a large degree. But I think also, let us not forget, in Africa we have a saying that when two giants fight, when two elephants fight, it's the grass that suffers. So the grass is suffering now because we're seeing Iraq being this caught up in the middle ground between the tensions between Iran and the US, and also we are seeing an impact on US-Iraq relations. And Iraq, being a linchpin of stability in the Middle East, has implications not only within the borders of Iran and its neighbor Iraq, but the broader Middle East region.
Minister, based on that and listening into what Donald Trump mentioned earlier on and calling on members of the Security Council and at least calling on NATO and saying that NATO must play a bigger role in the Middle East, do you think that that will help de-escalate the tensions that are currently playing out in the Middle East?
Well, the issue here is also the role of NATO, and where does NATO see itself here in relation to the national interests of the United States. And we believe that it's important for NATO to look beyond itself, look beyond even the United States, and look at the broader peace for the world. But also for the Security Council, I think the Security Council at this point in time, there's got to be a lot of diplomatic back and forth at this point, where all the nations under the United Nations should be able, and the special committees that deals with issues of peace and stability, there should be back and forth and a really active diplomatic engagement right now. You know, we can say all the things we want to say. What I think the entire world will want us to focus in is how do we make sure that the United States, and in particular with the current president, who probably sees things in his own world, where he believes that the escalation of the war, who he believes that even issues of such seriousness are issues that must be thrown into Twitter from time to time. Diplomacy is a very complicated thing, and engagements both at bilateral level for countries, at regional level and other levels is very complicated, and therefore it always needs to be treated with the respect, first and foremost, with the sensitivity that it deserves. All I can say is from the African National Congress, of course, we have condemned these acts of terrorism, as we say, because you can't be saying you are dealing with terrorism on the other side and you yourself, you act in a way that even your own people are not very happy with your own action. You've got your own legislation, you've got your own processes which you disrespect, and you expect the rest of the world really to respect that. So our call as the African National Congress is that we need to use every available avenues, including the conversations that we need to have with countries like Iran and Iraq itself. We've got bilateral engagements, and I think that at a government level, our Minister of International Relations, the President himself, will continue to find ways and means of engaging and using our capacity as South Africa, because, by the way, I keep repeating it, that our experience as a country in finding peace for ourselves and the means with which we did that is something that needs to be considered, and we've got experts and expertise in South Africa in the engagement. That's why we are saying to even our government, where there are opportunities for South Africa to get involved in the discussions there, we would really like to see ourselves stepping up and playing the role of peacemaker. We must remain. We say as African National Congress, we want to create a better Africa and a better world. We cannot ignore, therefore, what is happening now, especially because of the impact that it would have in the geopolitics, the global politics, as well as the balance of forces internationally, and especially those developing countries first and foremost, and progressive countries. That's why we are saying in our statement that we will join international progressive forces to find ways and means of finding solution. And we do believe that it is possible for us to have the conversations and reduce warmongering and reduce and not go into any form of war at all.
Yeah. Faith, considering, of course, the influence that the US has over NATO, and considering what NATO said, issuing a statement about two days ago, saying that they are standing behind the US in what some call the assassination of Qasem. Do you think that after this press briefing that has been delivered by Donald Trump, that we would see NATO playing a bigger role in the Middle East as he has called for?
Number one, we also need to contextualize the U.S.-NATO relations, right? So you're correct in pointing out that they backed up the order to assassinate Soleimani, but this was on the back of his activities, particularly in the region in Iraq, training the Shiite militias, him being appointment for Hezbollah and arming the Houthi rebels in Yemen. In that context, yes, then he was a potential, a pretty much formidable destabilizing factor in the region, hence they're backing up. But we must also look at it through the prism of just war. And according to just war tradition, they must, let me start with the UN Charter. The UN Charter clearly outlines what counts as self-defense in case there's a significant and armed attack. A preemptive attack of this nature has, we are straddling a very delicate area of international law because in one case there's a perspective that there hasn't been an attack. The whole basis of
the argument from the US and from Donald Trump was that there was an imminent attack.
Yes, so that is the question now. For NATO to engage, we also have to look at it at the prism. Remember, there's been strained relations, particularly in the transatlantic partnership around the EU and the US always saying why is the Europe relying militarily on the US and they're not carrying their weights in terms of collective defense. So there's that factor at once. Donald Trump is in desperate need of allies. He's completely isolated a lot of his traditional allies. The question of whether they'll actually back him up in the case, but engagement in a war of this kind has to have a very strong legal grounding, particularly adherent to the principles of international law. As for NATO, they will only activate their defense clause in the case that it meets the requirement of the just war.
And that would go through would that go through the Security Council?
Yes, in the case that it's determined to be a breach to international peace and security, then definitely it will have to go to the Security Council. But remember the dynamics of the Security Council, there's also paralysis because of the role that China and Russia play and the role that they play in terms of non-interference and respecting the sovereignty of states. So we are straddling a lot of a very lengthy impasse in this regard.
Minister, would the ANC support such a move that should this matter be presented to the United Nations Security Council, that NATO should play a bigger role in the Middle East? Would the ANC support such a resolution, the ANC-led government?
Well, look, we would rather have a regional solution. We would rather have the regional actors being the ones that are in the forefront and leading in this. Because the minute you start saying NATO must be the one that is leading, I think that we would have a bit of a difficulty there without necessarily undermining the role of NATO. But we think that what we should encourage more as the African National Congress, and I'm sure sure government would like to do that, is rather for us to get the regional actors to be united in their approach, whether it's issues of fighting against terrorism. It's complicated, I know, might be easier said than done, but we would rather have the regional actors,
Which
as well
actors
as
would those be,
progressive
Minister?
actors, people who have, pardon?
Which actors would those be? Or which stakeholders?
I'm talking about the...
Let's repeat that question. Which actors or which stakeholders would those be in the region?
Well, firstly and foremost, it has to be people that are acceptable, because it doesn't have to be the regional actors only. The regional actors must be the one that make that decision. Who do they want to be involved around the table? So who are the actors? The Iranians, the Iraqis, the entire region of the Middle East, even though we know that the Middle East region itself really is almost tattered and torn at this point in time, but we can never think that there aren't people that they can want to listen to in silencing the guns.
And that then brings the last question, Minister. Is there any stakeholder that you see as being neutral, who would be able to sit down as a mediator between the supreme leader of Iran as well as Donald Trump?
Well, that's a hard one, I must say, and I wouldn't want to pick up on anybody at this point in time, and I think that we need to take a little bit of time of doing a proper analysis of who could have the impact on both sides, by the way, because we don't look at it as a one way. I wouldn't have the answer right now, but I think that it would be important for us to focus on, one, the region itself, but also try and look at the African continent, because I believe that the African continent and the AU in particular would have to say something about this, because the AU itself has got peace and stability structures that have that interest of how do we start engaging, who do we engage with.
Yeah. Faith, let me ask you the same question. Do you see any stakeholder or any country, any particular person that you can identify and say that this may just be the neutral person who would be able to mediate between the US as well as Iran?
Well, I certainly concur with what the minister is saying about the dire situation, the fragmentation of alliances and relations in the Middle East between the countries. Certainly that's a constraining factor. But I would say to a large extent we're already seeing movement within the members of the UN Security Council trying to open up diplomatic windows to try and bring these people on the table. The Europeans have their own interests at heart. The regional question, as we've said, is completely partial to a large degree. So the question remains then, in a context like this where anarchy is high, who is the custodian of international law? And it brings me back to my question about, we must always remember what the UN Charter calls for in cases of breaches of international peace and security and the Pacific settlement of disputes. So we circle back to that region, but I would also want to bring back to your point about NATO. We must be very careful about NATO, because remember the legacy of NATO, the NATO-led intervention in Libya. Certainly we don't want to see another Libya and another sort of spillover effect. So,
Actually, on that point, Minister, in closing, what's currently unfolding in Libya, and many are arguing that maybe, just maybe, the South African-led, the ANC-led government should also bear some responsibility, at least, for the instability that Libya is currently facing. But what do you think should happen going forward?
Well, it's very unfortunate. Remember that the issue of Libya, really, it's something that in hindsight we can say all kinds of things. But if we go back to what actually was happening at the time in Libya itself, we would take responsibility in as far as ensuring that we assist that country in finding solutions. But we don't want to be going back and forth. What happened there? Do we take responsibility? We did not bomb Libya. area, by the way, and I don't want to get into that kind of a discussion right now. We need to look forward to saying, what is it that we can do, both as an organization as well as in government? And there's nothing wrong with us, actually, as the African National Congress and government, in re-looking at the resolutions and the decisions that were taken at that time and the impact thereof and what we have today. What we need to do right now is to say, what is it that we can do? The whole Middle East, as I say to you, it's tattered and torn. It's very unfortunate. Let's try and find solutions at the moment.
Well, thank you so much for that very diplomatic answer, Minister. The subcommittee chairperson of the ANC on International Relations, Lindiwe Zulu, as well as Faith Mabera, who is a researcher from the Institute for Global Dialogue. Really appreciate your time. African Perspective continues after this. Against the Refugees Amendment Act that became law on New Year's Day is mounting. The regulations ban refugees from taking part in political campaigns while in South Africa without special permission. With the suspicion that the new laws may be unconstitutional, political analyst Stephen Friedman says it's also morally wrong. He said that the ANC government is denying asylum seekers to do what the anti-apartheid activists did when they fought repression from abroad. Home Affairs Minister Aaron Motsoaledi spoke to SABC News earlier on.
This issue is a tired argument, basically, and it's a blackmail. To keep on being reminded that other countries helped South Africa to get liberation. Almost all countries on the continent which were under colonialism were held by other countries to fight for their liberation. But they are not being blackmailed for the rest of their lives. One can give an example of the Soviet Union, Russia. Russia is responsible, together with Cuba, for liberating lots and lots of countries in Africa, but they are not demanding anything from them. Recently, when the Russians wanted to put us in debt for life and for generations with the nuclear deal of about 1 trillion rand, all people fought. They never said this country liberated us, so let's allow them. So I don't understand this blackmail about liberation. Okay, and I've heard some of the criticism.
Let's go beyond the liberation struggle, Minister, but I do want to talk about, if you have some refugees who are here earnestly looking for asylum because of political persecution where they are, and they would like to ramp up not only at least some sort of sensitizing people about the conditions in their country, what it is that they're fighting for. Are you saying at South Africa that that can only happen unless people apply to you as a Minister of Home Affairs to partake in these political campaigns that could not only save them but their families back home?
So let me clarify one fact. I don't know whether it also confuses you, but I've heard others being confused. As if everybody who is another country, who is in South Africa, is going to be barred from any political activity. We have got lots of people who are here. Some have got permanent residence. Others are on long-term visas. They are lecturers in our universities. They are academics. Some are on student visas. Others own factories and big businesses and their own business visas. Others are naturalized citizens. These rules do not apply to them at all. They apply only to people who are under protection of the state. Those who are under Section 22 and 24 permits. Because they clearly said, I am running away from a regime that wants to kill me. Please protect me. And they are living under protection. And anybody who is living under protection also have to live under certain laws. Having said so, we did not just dream about that. If you go to the African Union Charter on Human and People's Rights, which has been ratified by 54 countries on our continent, When you look at Article 12 of that charter, it talks about rights of refugees and asylum seekers. But Article 23 talks about their responsibilities and obligations that countries must not allow their territories to be used as a springboard to attack other countries.
Well, for more on the impact of these amendments, we are now joined by Zimbabwean politician Jelesi Mawarira, who joins us in studio. Good evening and welcome to African Perspective. Just listening into what the Home Affairs Minister had to say there, and from the knowledge that you've gathered so far, what's your understanding of these amendments?
I think they are posing quite a lot of problems, especially if we look at the Zimbabwean situation as it is today. We have a lot of our people who, after the coup, have come here and sought protection from the South African government because they are being persecuted back home. And these are politicians. These are not just citizens, but these are politicians. These are politicians who have a right actually to participate in the politics of their country. And not only to participate, we are not advocating for our citizens to use South Africa as a launchpad to attack the government in Zimbabwe. But we are advocating that South Africa gives our people protection as they organize themselves in order to change the situation in Zimbabwe. Mm-hmm. I don't believe that the Minister of Home Affairs would like a situation where millions and millions of Zimbabweans come here to South Africa and put pressure on the social services delivery system in this country because they are being persecuted back home. Mm-hmm. You know, we don't want to create a situation where any autocratic regime will actually capitalize on this kind of an arrangement that has been introduced in South Africa in order to externally displace political opponents. It doesn't function, it doesn't entrench democracy. We thought our people who are here, who have run away from an autocratic regime, can actually learn one or two things about peaceful coexistence of political parties, as what happens here in South Africa. Yeah. And they can organize themselves around that, around peaceful coexistence as political opponents. We have seen politicians here in South Africa. There was a huge outcry at the ANC conference in Mangaung. Mm-hmm. But we didn't see any South African politician being displaced, externally displaced from this country. Those are things that our people, our politicians that have been displaced from Zimbabwe are beginning to learn, and how best
have you
they
ever
can entrench
interacted
that
with the lawmakers around this?
Sorry?
Have you ever interacted with the lawmakers around this, or
the lawmakers
do you know of
here
any
in South Africa?
Yeah, or do you know of any politicians who are in the country?
We just woke up to understand on the 1st of January, and we understand that it was introduced, it was made law on the 27th of December 2019. This is something that we are actually, some of us, we are even here, I'm even here, also to meet with the people that have been affected by the latest developments.
How have they been affected?
Because a lot of people are no longer certain of what they're supposed to do, of whether the South African government would allow to continue giving them the sort of protection that they were giving them prior to the enactment of that piece of legislation. And it's really painful that we are seeing that those that are seeking political asylum are being treated worse than prisoners, because we have member states within SADC that allow prisoners, people that are in jail, to go and vote. But what about those that have been externally displaced because of their strong political persuasions?
What's your biggest fear? And I know that there are some organizations and immigration lawyers who have said that this is unconstitutional. What's your biggest fear? That if this law goes unchallenged, may just lead to finish the sentence?
Every dictator in SADC, every dictator who is a neighbor of South Africa, every dictator within the SADC region would actually just externally displace political opponents, and South Africa will be actually abetting such kind of behavior. We want a political contestation that is availed to almost everyone. within member states, and even to those that are outside their countries of origin. They can organize their people, and it has been done in other countries. You know, you go to Germany, for instance. There is a civil society organizations for people that come from Syria. You have even in other countries like in Uganda, there have been studies that have been made among students that are refugees, and the findings have reflected that more and more of these students are learning good governance from their host countries, and they want to transfer those to their countries of origins. And they can only do that if they are organizing themselves. The Somalis, for instance, that live in Sweden, they've used that opportunity within the democratic dispensation in Sweden to organize themselves so that they go and engage in non-violent politics back in Somalia. And that is a plus. That is something that the South African government is actually not realizing. That there are quite a lot of democratic takeaways that our people are actually learning from South Africa. And we believe that our people can organize themselves whilst they are here in South Africa and transfer those democratic practices back to Zimbabwe. We have seen even when I came here for the burial of Mama Winnie Mandela, the EFF, the ANC, singing together, celebrating the life of this liberation hero here in South Africa, together without any qualms, without any fighting. And those are the takeaways that we want our people that are here, that have been externally displaced, to export back to Zimbabwe. We don't want them to be exporting only sugar, only basics, edible basics. But we want democratic practices to be exported to Zimbabwe.
There is a clause in the new legislation that allows for an applicant to go to the minister and get permission to campaign, for instance. Do you think that is not a right approach?
No, that's totally undemocratic. It gives a lot of power to the Minister of Home Affairs of South Africa. Then he becomes the sheriff.
Yeah, but then why would you think that the minister would act in an arbitrary manner if you are in the country where this particular minister is part of the executive, part of the lawmakers of the country? Why do you think that this person would act in an arbitrary manner? What is it? Are you suspicious of the government of South Africa?
In the earlier report, I'm not suspicious of the government of South Africa because the South African government has done quite a lot actually in helping us in Zimbabwe. But if you look at the tone from the clip that you played from the Minister of Home Affairs, his argument is that those that have been externally displaced, politically externally displaced, are here in South Africa trying to use South Africa as a launchpad to attack. He used the word attack governments in Zimbabwe or in any other African country for that matter. The issue is not about attacking governments, but the issue is about entrenching democracy. It's about availing our people the chance to participate in the governance of their countries. These are citizens. If you are a refugee, you have not renounced your citizenship in your country of origin. So you are supposed to participate in electoral politics. You are supposed to participate even in voting. That's why we are advocating for diaspora vote. We want the more than 3 million people that are here in Zimbabwe who send their remittances to Zimbabwe, including those that are refugees, to actually use the provision for a diaspora vote to vote and determine the kind of government that they want in Zimbabwe. Most of these people don't want to stay here in South Africa. If we create, or if you help them, or let the South African authorities let them organize themselves to create a conducive environment in Zimbabwe, they would want to go back to Zimbabwe and participate in whatever is happening in Zimbabwe, be it politics or economic development in the country. That is what we want. We are not attacking anyone, but we want to deepen democracy. And you can only deepen democracy by allowing as many people as possible to participate in the governance of their country.
Speaking about what the ministers just spoke about, that some people would use the country as a launchpad, we refer you to the case, for instance, of Henry Oka. he's convicted, and the terrorist attacks were planned here, according to the judgment. So doesn't the minister have a legitimate claim that there is a possibility, at least, of the country being used as a launch pad? And I know that even the president of Rwanda, Paul Kagame, has argued the same in saying that South Africa has become a haven for terrorists.
But we should differentiate between fugitives and refugees. We are talking of refugees. We are talking of people that have been externally displaced from their countries because of political participation.
Yeah.
We are not talking of people that are running away from the law.
Yeah, but there are
people
some
that are running away from the law.
There are Zimbabweans. Are there not Zimbabwean politicians who are running away from the law in Zimbabwe because they believe that the government is using its powers to clamp down on opposition parties? Is that not the case?
That's not the case, because in circumstances where there was that suspicion, there were attempts by the Harare government to engage Interpol. And Interpol, after making investigations, actually concluded that these people were not fugitives from the law, but they were running away from the coup. And some of the people were ministers, and their homes were attacked. They were attacked by tracer bullets. They were attacked by live ammunition by the army. So if you look at such a person, then you call that person he is running away from prosecution, or he's running away from live bullets that were fired by the army. The army is not a court of law. The army was used in Zimbabwe to chase these politicians away. And that's a totally different scenario. You can have the same army now trying to trump up charges against the same people
just
that
quickly,
they,
in conclusion,
they chased away using bullets.
Will you try to challenge this new legislation in court?
No, I wouldn't conclusively say we would do that, but there are wide consultations.
Would you support an organization that says it is challenged?
I'm saying there are consultations, and I don't want to preempt the consultations that we're making. I think the decision should be collective, and we're making consultations to see how best we can engage with the authorities here, and also if there is need. And that should be a collective decision. If there is need then to take the legal route, then so be it. We'll support that.
Jealousy Moira, thank you so much for your time. We've come to the end of this evening's program. Thank you so much for watching. Next week on the show, South Africa is ready to take over as the African Union chair. We'll have conversations around that. We know that President Cyril Ramaphosa will be taking up that seat next month.